right? Because what has been, if you look at the last 10 years, right, before the present election, the election that was just recently concluded, and those last 10 years, what was the summation of that? What was the end point? It was a Ram Mandir, okay, inaugurated on January 22nd in Ayodhya. And where did those 10 years begin? They began with something I mentioned a little while ago, with the pronouncement by the Prime Minister, right, that now India was going to be delivered from 1200 years of slavery. 1200 साल की गुलामी, right? 1000 years of, Muslim rule, 150 odd years of British rule, and then, of course, the rule of the secularists, right? Right? They all colonized us too, because we were not able to live our lives as Hindus, feel pride as as Hindus, and all of that. And I'm born into a Hindu family, so he certainly doesn't speak for me. I can tell you that, in having taken that view that he did. But let's think about it. That has been the very prominent note. And I know the question was not asking me about what the Indian left should do, but I have long thought that that was a fundamental problem with the left here and with the human rights activists as well. They cited constantly things like, yeah, the economic data suggests that the country is doing so poorly. How does this guy still, why does the BJP still win? Because frankly, the bulk of the people, particularly Hindus, did feel, partly as a consequence of the claims that have been advanced on behalf of them, they did feel that now they could live for the first time with some sense of pride as Hindus. But this in turn means that they now finally are moving out of a conception of Hinduism as a religion of mythos to a conception of Hinduism which is based on a reading where Ram then becomes an established historical personage. Right? And of course, the whole Ram Janamburi movement, and beginning with the supposition that there is a Ram Janmastan, that Ram was actually born, that Ram Janmastan, the place where Ram was born, literally. Why this never interested anybody in India for 2000 years? Nobody had the remotest interest in thinking in that way. And the same holds true for Krishna, right? So, what I'm suggesting here simply is this, that when we're thinking about decolonization, because I'm still speaking around the question that Rijul had asked me about decolonization, giving a very long, elaborate kind of answer through various ways. But fundamentally, we're going to have to think about how the instrumentalization, what today people call the weaponization, that's another word that I don't like, weaponization. But the instrumentalization of history, okay, has become critically important to the Hindu right. And the same people are talking about decolonization, not realizing that this is the most profound way in which we got colonized, was when we started to think that history would deliver the answers and that we could then instrumentalize history for certain purposes. You see? You get the gist of what I'm suggesting. So does that answer the question, Rijul, more or less?
Yes, sir. It was a very extensive answer. But yeah, moving on to the next question. In 2005, the Texas-based Vedic Foundation and Hindu Education Foundation were a part of a major controversy where they complained California's curriculum commission that portrayed Indian history and Hinduism in Californian textbook was biased. While the political
Yes.
context of censorship in India would be very different in the United States, it is also constituted that the attempt of a minority community to represent its history. Such nativism is all. Uh, Such nativism is also seen where groups have been historically oppressed, are skeptical to the scholarly enterprises, which often feature scholars from historically privileged communities. How do we reconcile these differences?
Okay, so look, I mean, again, it's a question on which I can speak at very great length, partly because I was involved in this matter. I was among the scholars who wrote in opposition, okay, to foundation that you had mentioned. And I had written a very long open letter which got published in India West. So in California, and the part of the country that you're speaking about is California. So this is in the California, the most important Indian American publication was India West. In New York, it was India Abroad. So different uh, publication there. So India West published a very long open letter that I'd written on this. So I can speak to this question at great length, but I'm going to try to be brief, okay, because we'll try to just get to the gist of it now. And the first thing is this, that um, uh, the last comment part of your question uh, is the is the uh, is the question on which I think most people will concentrate today. Back then in 2005, that was less the case. What do I mean by that? That you are pointing to, in the last part of your question or your comment, you are pointing to the the upper caste background of many of the scholars or people purporting to be scholars, writing on behalf of the Hindu Education Foundation, complaining that the representation of Hindus in California history textbooks and the representation of India more broadly was inaccurate. So they had objected to it. Uh, this was not emphasized as much, the background of these people, as it would be today, because in the last 5-10 years there has been a very strong anti-caste, anti-Brahminical lobby that has also developed, and of course there's been a backlash to that as well. This the upper caste scholars and the Brahmins, and and their supporters have mobilized too. But I don't like to look at it that way, because I think that uh, uh, it's not a question so much of Brahmins or upper caste people necessarily. I don't think that this is as central to it as I think a number of other questions, okay, to which I'm going to speak about in the broadest way. So the first point is this, that many of the people who were agitating. So, what were they agitating about? Let's be very clear so that everyone understands this, because there are some people in India who may not understand fully what is at stake here. That history textbooks, like all textbooks in the state of California, and we're going to just confine ourselves to that state for the okay, they undergo a periodic review. And when they undergo a periodic review, a physics textbook, I think you will appreciate, is not likely to excite any kind of attention. What has been said about the law of gravity is going to remain unchanged over a long period of time. But what is said about Vedic civilization or Hinduism, or uh, the Saraswati civilization, etc., etc. All of this changes over a period of time as scholarship changes. Okay, so when a review is done, a periodic review is done, people from the community are invited to submit their comments before the commission, which is authorized to pass these textbooks. Before the commission does that, they will take into account the comments that have been offered by members of the community. So in this case, what is it that members of the Hindu community, and we have to again say some members of some Hindu community, because clearly they're not speaking for everyone, right? And we should never suppose that has always been one of the ploys, the supposition that they speak for all Hindus, which I don't think we should accept, much as it should never be accepted here in India itself. Okay, so what are some of the things they objected to? One of the things they objected to was that Hinduism was mentioned as being a polytheistic religion. Okay, and they said this it's not a polytheistic religion. Okay, they objected to the fact that women in India were described in ancient India were described as having a second class status. Okay, they objected to that. All right, so I'm giving you two illustrations of the kinds of things that they objected to. Right now, let's look at it this way. Okay, first question is, which I've already actually explicitly mentioned, that they claim to be speaking for Hindus. Let's understand who they're speaking for. All right. Number two, it is critically important to understand that very often the same people who are now claiming that, look, we are minorities in America, and therefore people should be attentive to us as a minority. Okay, the same people say absolutely nothing about the status of minorities in India. Nothing. So, Muslims could be getting lynched. A Muslim's house might be raided because of some allegation that their refrigerator has beef in it. I'm not making this up. All of this was happening in the capital city of India, in Delhi, among other places. And you all know of cases where you know people were stopped. They were transporting cattle. You had actually purchased cattle at a fair, and then the person, Muslim, is killed. We know of all these cases. I'm not even mentioning names here because I'm just putting a generic sense so that we don't get fixated on one particular case. Okay. Now, what I'm saying is that we have to understand the nature of minority claims. That's quite important because it's always been, I think, a source of criticism for me that the people who back in the US, the Hindus among the Indian Americans who are saying, and the Hindu, there's a foundation called the Hindu American Foundation. The Hindu American Foundation was not part of this because it barely existed. I don't even remember when it came into existence, but it was just around this time. And maybe it came into existence as a consequence of this in part. It's been around for 15, 20 years. So it was not really, I don't think, if I recall correctly now, it's been a while now, because I think this all goes back to 2005 or so approximately. But the Hindu American Foundation, which is a lobby based out of Washington, D.C., okay, and incidentally, they completely want to emulate the Zionists, right? From their point of view, they need to learn. Indians need to learn from the state of Israel, and they need to learn from Jewish people how to mobilize. And I'm not going to comment on that, except to simply refer to the obvious, that there's a genocide going on in Gaza right now. So you can evaluate the merit of their observation about emulating Israel and the Israel lobby in the United States. Okay, but they're very adamant about that we need to learn from that. And just look at there's a slightest minute incidents of anti-Semitism or purported anti-Semitism, anti-defamation league, and the US will be on your case immediately. And that's what they want. The Hindu American Foundation, if there's the slightest aspersion about anything having to do with Hinduism, the attention should be focused on that person. Okay, so what I'm saying simply is this: organizations such as these have never said anything fundamentally about the rights of minorities in India itself. They're very keen to claim the democratic privileges that come to them as a minority in America, but Let's not worry about minority. In India, it becomes minorityism if you start speaking about minorities from their point of view. Okay, so we should register that. That's part of the politics of what was happening. All right. Now let's look at the specific claims. I get let the two illustrations. See, I think there is a problem, but this is not how they understand the problem. There is a problem. If they had expressed it in this way, then I would say there's the beginning of a conversation. Because at the same time, unlike many of my friends, I come from what I call a background where I have learned from Gandhi and had learned from the Jain perspective, okay, which is that there's a many perspectiveness of reality, many sidedness, okay, of reality. Now, let's supposing that they had posed the argument in this way, namely that there is a problem in trying to understand the nature of Indian history through the template of European history. Let's say that they had put it as a general proposition. Then I would say that's the basis of a conversation. Because I think that that is a problem. The very fact that we teach history in this country and in nearly every part of the world, how so? How do we teach it? We carve it up into three segments: ancient, medieval, modern. Right? Well, where did this tripartite division come from? Why is it being applied to India? And remember that the word medieval in Europe was synonymous with another word. What was that? Between the ancients and the moderns, there was something called the Dark Ages. In fact, that was the most commonly used word, the Dark Ages. Okay? Now, simply because it was dark for them, and it was dark for them for various reasons, right, doesn't mean it was dark for us. But this was the supposition. This became the supposition here. The whole Hindutva, the 1200 years, 1200 ki saal ki gulami jo hai, what is it? It goes back to the Muslim, beginning of the Muslim period in India. This was a darkness descended upon us. You see, right? Well, frankly, in fact, it was, you could argue it was one of the richest periods of our past. One of the richest periods, the whole efflorescence of Bhakti literature. And we're not talking about 4 or 5 major poets, we're talking about 100. If you put their literature together, it is the greatest stash of devotional literature in the world. Right? We're not just talking about Tukaram and Naneshwar and Mirabai and Kabir and Chondi Das. We're talking literally about 100 major poets almost, at least 30 or 40 who are really of paramount significance. And in each of these languages that we today have, the Bhakti literature played a critical role, even in moving that literature ahead, the language ahead. Okay? And the whole Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb that people talk about, the Indo-Islamic cultural synthesis that developed, that was again in the so-called medieval period, what was the Dark Ages back in Europe. So see, if the fundamental argument that they were making was that, look, let's not try to understand the Indian past through the European past. Okay? Then I would say that's the beginning of a conversation. But no. What are the two examples that I picked on that they pointed out? Okay? That women in India, they argue, had elevated status. Frankly, I think that's completely bogus. Completely bogus. Simply by virtue of the fact that you did have, for example, in the Upanishads, you have at least one woman philosopher, maybe a few. Okay, there's a reference to Gargi and the fact that she constantly poses questions to Yajnavalkya, and poses very interesting and difficult questions, right? To the extent that finally she's told, yeah, stop asking these questions because my head is going to drop off, right? No one is suggesting that women didn't have a role to play in various ways. Okay. But I think the evidence is overwhelming from what we know that women in India, similar to women elsewhere, were in a position of subordination. Right? That's, I think, the gist of the matter, you see, right? And if you take the second, the problem is more acute. See, their objection that Hinduism is being described as a polytheistic religion, the problem here is that this goes back to the question of categories. The problem here is that they want to argue it's a monotheistic religion, which they say. Frankly, I think that's not just intellectually wrong, it's intellectually uninteresting to think of it that way. In other words, these are not the categories through which we thought about. You see, our dharma, okay, thought about our gods. Polytheism, monotheism. These are the categories of a theology that came out of the West. Okay? Now, we have to think about what are the ways in which we then thought about our gods and what are the kinds of hierarchies that really developed. And the Puranic literature is a very interesting literature there, because if you think about the Puranas, you can broadly put them into, I would say, into three categories. Right? You can speak about the Shaivite Puranas, you can speak about the Vaishnava Puranas, and you can speak about the Shakto Puranas, the Devi Puranas, where the goddess is, all important. And the Vaishnava ones, Vishnu is all important, and the Shaivite ones, Shiva is all important. But it's not the case that the Shaivite Puranas, and why do we have so many of these gods, right? The fact that we have so many of these gods, I'll get back to the Puranas in just a minute, that we are speaking about multiple gods. And much in the way in which the Greeks had many different gods. Right? Now, that is because you have to think of the world of mythos there. Okay, this is where the word myth, by the way, has become a very big problem in the English language, because the word myth today has simply been reduced to falsehood. Yeah, if someone says something and someone says, "Oh, I heard such and such," and you say, "Oh, it's a myth," meaning there's no veracity to it. It's completely false. It's not verifiable. This is a very impoverished use of the word myth. When we speak about Greek mythology or Hindu mythology, what we're really speaking about is a way of comprehending the world, and particularly a way of comprehending the relationship between the gods and humans, because the gods and the humans are on a continuum. They're on a continuum. A god can, through certain ways, descend into becoming an asura through acts that are not proper, and then even descend to becoming a human. And a human can rise, so to speak. That's why Emerson said, the American transcendentalist philosopher, man, and I'm quoting him exactly, man is a god in ruins. How interesting, right? Now, you see, the fundamental issue then, therefore, is simply this, that if you look at the Puranic literature, so you will see that the Shaivite Puranas, it's not that they don't have any space for Vishnu, but Vishnu is subsidiary. He's secondary. The Vaishnava Puranas will elevate Vishnu and the avatars of Vishnu, but it's not that they don't have any place for Shaivism. They do. Shiva is secondary there. That's how this word works. And how do you describe this word? You cannot describe it through monotheism, which is what they wanted to do. That's what they wanted to do. And you see, this project, in a way, goes back. This project of saying that, look, Hinduism should really be viewed as a monotheistic religion, because The reason why they wanted to goes back to the early 19th century. It goes back, guess to whom? Ram Mohan Roy. It goes back to him because he was the first Indian who really began to use the template of Christianity, particularly the template of Protestant Christianity, to begin to reshape the Hindu worldview. Right? And I think that is going back to the question that you had asked, Rijul. So I've addressed the gist of it. The several first is to place it within a wider politics of what we think about minorities and so on. And I should add as a little footnote that actually even the language of majority and minority is a relatively recent language. India is a civilization. Let's go back to the first question, civilization. One of the things of being a civilization is you don't think through the language of majority and minority. When you begin to think through that, you have definitely become a nation state, albeit, as in the case of India, still an incomplete nation state, because that is the whole project of the Hindutva project, is to make us into a complete, proper nation state, you see, right? Okay. Majority and minority is a certain kind of political arithmetic. And now, of course, it's inescapably a part of who we are all over the world because electoral politics has a inextricable relationship with minority and majority. You know, the whole question of vote banks drawing upon certain minorities to support your case, to vote for you, you know, pitting one group against another. This is all part of a certain kind of political arithmetic that has now become part of the common sense of our culture. Okay, and I introduced that phrase common sense here deliberately because one of the ways in which I think we should think about what we do is we need to think about how certain things become part of the common sense of a culture. You see, and that is very important because when they become part of the common sense of a culture, they are no longer questioned. And it is slowly what Hindutva is doing. I'm going to give you a very different language to describe the project of Hindutva. Hindutva is trying to create a different common sense for our culture. I don't believe anyone has ever put it in that framework. That's a framework I would suggest to you. I've suggested others when we were speaking about decolonization. It's trying to create a new common sense for our culture. That common sense means certain things that become part of that common sense of our culture are no longer questioned. In the way in which, let me give you a very pedestrian example having nothing to do with Hinduism, and then I come back to that. Okay. So, for example, when someone says, and you must be hearing that phrase every day, oh, we have to think outside the box. You know, I always tell them anyone who uses that phrase, don't expect anything from them. Don't expect anything from anyone who uses that phrase because now it becomes part of the common sense of our culture. Think outside the box. What does that mean? When we start to rehearse cliches all the time, right, there's going to be a difficulty. There's going to be a real difficulty. Or someone says, this is not rocket science. Why? So what's so difficult about rocket science? Or what's so interesting about rocket science? First, somebody has to explain that to me. You know, it's like we should all pay our veneration to rocket science because it's some very esoteric field. I mean, what are rocket scientists doing anyhow? Just helping to destroy the world, as far as I can tell. They haven't done anything singularly good for humanity. So why anybody in his right mind should ever want to use that expression to suggest, oh, somebody belongs to an elevated sphere? Yeah, elevated sphere of destruction, if you ask me, right? See, this becomes part of the common sense of our culture. We think, there's this field, and my God, this is the summation of knowledge. You know, this is not rocket science. I hear this every day. Somebody will say something and say, yaar, isko samajh nahi aa rahi hai. Rocket science to nahi hai, yaar. Samajh kyun nahi aa rahi hai tujhe? Right? That's the expression. Now, thinking through history, transforming our understanding of Hinduism so it becomes a religion of history, not a mythos, this is becoming part of the common sense of what it means to be a Hindu. Okay? And I think this is something we have to be really wary of. We have to really question that, probe that, and not let anyone get away with that. And we'll have to think of all the different ways in which certain things become part of the common sense of our culture. And you can take examples from across the board in all spheres of life, you know, where things become part of the common sense of our culture. You take, I, as a matter of principle, okay, student, I've taught at 31 years for the same institution. So you can imagine I've had lots of students I've taught. And some of the undergraduates come to me, the ones who have done very well, and say, Professor Lal, I'm going to be applying to Harvard or Pennsylvania, UPenn, or whatever. And I took 2 classes with you and I got an A in both of them. And may I ask you for a letter of recommendation? And I say, so what is the letter of recommendation you want? In other words, what are you going to study? And they say, I want to do MBA. And I tell them flatly, I don't write letters for anyone who wants to do MBA because business administrations, business schools shouldn't exist in my view. Okay, they're not part of my worldview. I think they're illegitimate enterprises, and I say, I'm sorry, I simply can't write for you. I have nothing against you, but I simply do not write letters for people who do business. And many of these are Indian students, and they're Gujaratis. And I tell them, let me tell you a little bit. Your forefathers ran all over the world. Okay, for 1,000 years, there were Gujaratis all over the Indian Ocean world. There are lots of historical works that testify to that. They did fantastically well. Okay, and they never went to any business school, I can assure you. I tell them, and of course they say to me, the common rejoinder, yeah, but the business is a lot more complicated now. Yes, it's a lot more complicated, but it's like the mathematicians. The best mathematicians still use a paper and pencil. you know and tell them, you need to just rethink what this whole idea of doing business and doing it well is. Okay, I just want you to. So I tell them, if you're seriously interested, read these 5 books and come back to me after 2 months and we'll have a discussion. And then I may consider it. And of course, they never come back. No one has ever come back. Where I tell them, read these books about business history or about the categories of knowledge, or etc., etc. Because you see, what is it now? It's part of the common sense of the culture that if you want to succeed in business, even if you come from a business-minded family which has been doing very good business for 300 years, like the Marwadis, for example, they had a whole system, right? Even if you come from that, you still want to go and do an MBA now at Harvard because you think that being credentialed at Harvard is going to do everything for you. And then I tell them that, you have ever heard of the Dibbawalas in Mumbai, because Harvard Business School uses that as a case study. There are millions of these lunch boxes that are delivered, right, by the Tiffinwalas in Bombay. They don't use any computers, nothing. It's just a color coding system. And I tell them Harvard uses that as a case study, right? But of course, it's part of the common sense of our cultures to also think of so-called world-class universities. What does Ashoka University in this country want to do? It just wants to become another mini Harvard. It's pathetic, frankly, completely pathetic, if you ask me. And this is all part of being colonized. So we are now back to all the questions we have talked about: civilization, decolonization, doing history, right?
So, do you have time for one quick concluding question?
One last question, and I'll see if I can keep the answer very short. Yeah.
So, just since you have had a very interesting educational trajectory, whether or your training as a social scientist, so I mean, one part of it is any quick advice for aspiring historians and aspiring social scientists, And since you covered what's been happening at Columbia, a few quick reflections on student activism, before we call it a day.
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, I mean, so I'm at UCLA, as you know, and on the East Coast, Columbia University was the epicenter of the, if one wants to speak of the epicenter, I mean, very casually, informally, because the student protests have really been throughout the country in the U.S. Right? I mean, there were over 250 universities where encampments were set up. Um, by the way, also encampment. What is this word encampment? Nobody ever heard of it before. This, and now everybody is using it as they always knew what it was. It's always been a part of the dictionary. So again, these are very interesting ways in which how things get normalized. Okay, but let's leave that aside for a moment. So on the East Coast, it was Columbia. On the West Coast, it was my university, UCLA. Right. So I know exactly what happened, and I wrote a document which can be found on my blog, vinelal.wordpress.com. I wrote an open letter to Chancellor of the university, a very strongly worded open letter, uh, which where I condemned, among other things, the university action, because my university was the site of perhaps some of the worst violence that took place on university campuses. Now, I'm going to have to be very brief because I have lots of thoughts about dissent, student unrest. I know the history of that. Uh, Not only the contemporary history, I know the history going back to the 1960s. And I wrote an article in Open Magazine about what happened at Jamia and JNU as well. 3.5, 4 years ago. So I've been keeping abreast of that, and I know the history of that in India as well. So I'll be very brief because it's possible to introduce lots of nuances, but the gist of it is this: and then I'll go back to the first part about any words of advice for young historians and so on. That there are certain problems certainly in the student uh, movement. There's no question about it. However, these are not the problems that the opponents have pointed out. The opponents suggest that these are forms of anti-Semitism. I strongly object to that and repudiate that. And I know certainly firsthand from what happened at UCLA, where at least two students I know who were in my class got arrested. Um, uh, and I know from speaking to lots of the students and going to some of the demonstrations and going to the university, the night the police came, they cleared it at 1:40 using extreme violence. It was horrifying, absolutely horrifying to think that this university campus had been transformed into a garrison state. And American police is not like the English Bobby. I mean, these people have been issued weapons that the military uses, because that's one of the things that happened in the United States over the last 20 years. Military grade weapons are handed down to the police departments. These people are very heavily armed. You had 200 of these armed. You would think that you were really in a war zone. I mean, God's sake, it's just some students who are protesting what's happening in Gaza, right? And this is the university reaction to it. And to say that these students were animated by anti-Semitism is completely false, completely false. It should be completely repudiated. One of the most astonishing things about these student protests, and I'm greatly encouraged by that, is to see the revival of student activity, because I myself have often thought that, yeah, look, universities are no longer sites of learning, unfortunately. All that the students want to do is come there, get a degree, and get a job. What does education have to do with getting a job? Ideally, it should be simply to just come to the university and to flourish intellectually, to grow. But at least now the students were animated, and what is so interesting is that it was the greatest mix of students you could think of. Lots of the people who are going to read this, or will be in India, should be heartened to know South Asians were well represented in all the student protests all over the United States. If you listen to the interviews, you'd find so many of the students who were involved and who were the spokesperson were South Asians, and not necessarily Muslims. That's the interesting thing. So you're talking not just about Palestinian and Arabs and Muslims who were taking part, and you're talking about white people and South Asians and Chinese and Jewish students. Significant number of Jewish students. So I think this should be underscored, and I hope the students in India will take a leaf out of that, at least in this respect, because as I said, I'm always a little wary about, taking examples from there and just simply transplanting them over here. But I think that there, and of course I know what happened here, I went to the Shaheen Bagh. Of course, that was not student led initially. There were the women of Shaheen Bagh, but we know that it's intertwined with a number of other circumstances. And women who came out of Shaheen Bagh, in fact, came out because of the violence that had been committed against the students at Jamia. All right. So it's all intertwined there, and so I know that the students played a role here. And in that sense, they don't need to learn really anything from what happened there in the US. But I think rather the best way to put it is, I think we have to think about the particular cross sections here. We have to think about the intersections. We have to think about the ways in which we can develop these movements together. Okay. So the gist of it is that I think that the student movements in the US, the student unrest, I think it's been very encouraging. I think largely it's been inspired by sentiments that I think are correct, a feeling of injustice being committed against people in Gaza. Whether the objectives they stipulate, divestment, etc., whether these can be met, whether the students adhere to the highest standards of nonviolence, that's questionable. But they're students; they're still learning, and it's not as though nonviolence can be understood in a very rigid way. That when you're in the flow of things of this kind, things take their own course. Okay, so as I said, there may be some issues, but on balance, there is no question whatsoever that what happened there in the United States, and then to some extent in other countries, a few other countries, particularly in Europe, I think is very encouraging. Going back to the first part of your question, I don't know if I'm in the position to give really any advice to anyone as such. Okay, that is that I speak my thoughts, I speak my mind. I have a certain way of thinking about the world, but I would say a few things. Okay, not by way of how do you achieve, because I get several emails every day from somebody in India. Sir, how do I join the IAS? I've heard your lectures, or I've seen your lectures, or this or that. Sir, how can I prepare well for exams? Well, read the Prime Minister's book, Exam Warriors. How to prepare for exams. Get a good night's sleep. Make sure you have sharpened pencils and you've done a few yoga asanas. If you've ever read that book, it's comical actually. Exam Warriors. I mean, it's written really for a 5-year-old. Contrast that with what a former prime minister wrote, a book called The Discovery of India. Okay, and you'll see the contrast. But on a more serious note, I would say first, have or develop a kind of an intellectual curiosity. Be capacious in your reading. College, particularly, as a time, and Indian colleges, unfortunately, they're much more restrictive. What you can do. The syllabus is set more or less. In the US, it's very different. There's so many electives. Here it's much more difficult. But even here, because a college education is not only what you learn in the class. It's going to the dhaba. Okay, The Ganga Dhaba at JNU has been famous for all kinds of reasons. It's the conviviality, the collegiality, the conversations, the animated life. This is part of what it means to be college, and that gets enhanced if you're a person of capacious interests and you read widely. And please, reading widely doesn't mean, spending 2 hours on WhatsApp. I mean, that's not reading. Uh, you know, in fact, this device should be thrown out for a good part of the day. Should just be thrown out. Keep it away, because it's very difficult to get serious reading done when this is around you all the time. Okay, um, so I'd say first, be a person of wide intellectual curiosity. Don't think of instrumentalizing your learning all the time. It need not lead to a job, it need not lead to an outcome. Okay. Number two, learn to live with ambiguity. I think this is very important. Ambiguity. That is that, there are many ways to understand that too. Okay. One of the ways to understand is what I've already hinted at, if, in my remarks before, namely that, there is this many sidedness to reality, there are many different perspectives. And one should not be convinced that one's own position encompasses the entire truth. That is almost never the case. Almost never the case. There's something in the other position. I might, in my conversations, say, oh, this is absurd or something, but notice how I said, okay, look at the Hindu education founded. Let's say they had used a different language, because then we try to find a common ground. You have to try to find that common ground, because otherwise you're living in a world where there's animosity all the time. But it's not simply to make life more comfortable. That's not the point of this. The point of it is that that it's very difficult to think of any single point of view that can be encompassed in its totality. So in the present conflict, over Gaza, I have very strong views. I've written 3 odd pieces for the Indian Express. I think I have a new one coming out in a couple of days. I sent it to them a couple of days that they had asked me to. And, my views of Israel are becoming more and more uh, uh, rigid. And I worry about that too, a little bit too. But they're becoming a little more rigid because of what's happening, the scale of it. I think Israel is impervious to anything or to anyone. Uh, you know, but nevertheless, I know that obviously there are some uh, things within Israel that one can look forward to. So if one thought there was nothing there, for example, the best source, I can assure you, the best source, not just for information, but for analysis and criticism of what Israel is doing, is still coming from Israel. It's coming from the Haaretz newspaper, which is a newspaper that comes out. And you read what Gideon Levy, who's an Israeli, who lives in Israel, who's been an editor of the Haaretz for a while. I mean, no one can be as critical as he has been of what Israel has done. So there is at least some self-reflexivity in some of the people there, you see, right? And that can become the common ground for thinking about, if you were thinking about, oh yeah, Israel, I don't want to think about this. This place should be, completely out of my horizon. It shouldn't exist. If somebody took that view, which some people do, right? Well, I think we need to check ourselves. Okay. So when I speak of ambiguity, I'm not speaking about, I'm speaking of a certain kind of ambiguity where we realizes that there are gray areas, and let's revel in these gray areas. Let's enjoy them, because that's what makes life interesting, intellectually, ethically. What is the question in the Mahabharata, right? What is dharma? Dharma is a very slippery thing. Very slippery. How do you know exactly, right, what is the right thing to do at a certain point in time? So my thing is, I try to tell my students, be a person of wide intellectual interest, be capacious in your thinking, okay? Entertain some degree of ambiguity about things, okay? And third, which is related to the second, but I put it in, is question the common sense of the culture. Question what has taken for granted always, okay? These are the ways in which one begins to interrogate things and begins to live, I think, a richer intellectual and ethical and political life. So that's what I would really say. I never really give them advice as such. I mean, except when my own PhD student is on says, well, how do I position myself in the job market? Obviously, then I'll tell them something about how they're going to position themselves, how they're going to prepare for the interview, right? But your question is as a more generic level. What would I say to an aspiring student who's interested in, uh, you know, uh, thinking about a life in the academy, uh, life as an intellectual? And by the way, the life in the academy is not really the life of an intellectual for the most part, because most people end up doing very pedestrian things very often. So a public intellectual and a scholar and an academic, there's some overlap, and then in some ways these are all quite discrete things. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for that insightful answer. This interview has almost reached 2 hours now,
Yeah.
almost 30 minutes beyond the 90 minutes mark,
Yeah.
but it was a very fulfilling conversation. It would be great to have you back sometime
Sure.
for another
Sure.
topic.
It'd be my pleasure. Yeah. And I do request that that before you print it, please share it with me in
Huh.
case there are any corrections or anything. Yeah. Right. um, uh, so that would be nice, and I'll be happy to speak to you maybe one of these days on Palestine.
Hmm.
uh, Gandhi, I recommend, by the way, to everyone, if you've never read it, a piece that Gandhi wrote. It's simply called The Jews. It's published in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. You can find it on the internet, 26th November 1938. Nothing as insightful as that has ever been written, in my view, astonishingly. And this by a person who had never gone to Palestine. He'd gone to Egypt, he had stopped in Egypt, um, and who was far removed from what was happening because, of course, by this time, the last time he had left India was when he had gone for the Roundtable Conference, right? Um, and that was several years ago. And this is 1938. And, that was his last overseas trip when he'd gone for the Roundtable Conference. And uh, after that, he never left India. But there are a few scholars, Norman Finkelstein being one of them, a Jewish scholar, who actually wrote a little book on Gandhi. I think he's now taken a harder view. I think more recently in view of what's been happening in Gaza now, I think he's not so firmly persuaded that nonviolence and Gandhi's ideas, uh, you know, uh, should be tried out. But certainly, uh, some years ago, he wrote that book, uh, uh, you know, uh, which is basically Gandhi's writings on the Jews and on the Jewish question, uh, where he took the view that Gandhi was extraordinarily insightful. But in any case, whatever Finkelstein thinks, my own view is that what he wrote on 26 January, published on 26 January 19, November, sorry, 26 November 1938, I think is still the most extraordinary document, about thinking about a Jewish homeland, who does Palestine belong to, etc. Yeah. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me.